Hello and welcome to the first of 5 podcasts which are all about medicine through time. The first of these podcasts is the one that you are listening to now, and this is going to be on causes of disease. The reason that we're starting with the causes of disease is because it lays the foundations for all of the other strands: treatment, training of doctors and nurses, hospitals, and finally public health. So it's important to understand the foundations of what people believed caused illness before the other strands can theoretically then develop. We're going to look at how causes of disease change from the Romans right through to modern day, how it got better, worse throughout time periods, how sometimes it continued, and fundamentally thinking about the factors that are causing that change, whether that be regressive, which means moves backwards, or progressive, moves forwards. Okay, so we're going to start off our time period in the Roman era. Now, when the Romans conquered Britain in 43 AD, they brought their ideas with them. The Roman Empire relied on having healthy citizens to keep it running. So therefore, healthy soldiers, so the army could keep the peace. Healthy workers, traders, farmers, so that the whole empire could effectively keep running and was wealthy and was fed. This meant that the Romans were interested in what they could do to improve health, though they were less interested in what caused illness in the first place. That's not to say they had no interest at all in what caused disease, and they had 3 effectively basic ideals on what they believed caused illness. And many of this came from the Greeks. The Greek physician in particular, known as Hippocrates. Now, Hippocrates came up with the fundamental basic idea of the causes of illness for Roman physicians, and this was the 4 humours. Hippocrates said the whole body was made up of 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and everybody had a certain amount of that flowing through their bodies. And all of these elements were dependent also and linked into the seasons. If you ever look at a 4 humours chart, which physicians would have used, you can see how the seasons linked into each element of the humours, each humour. Now, Hippocrates believed, and so did the Romans, that if there was too much, say, of phlegm within the body, that humour would need to be put back into balance, whether that be through making perhaps someone be sick, making someone go to the toilet, whether that be, if blood was out of balance, to be getting rid of some of that blood. So it was all about balancing things out. And if you listen to the second podcast, we look at how treatment is used to try and balance those out. The second belief, which was taken up by sort of the majority, a number of citizens rather than educated and the physicians, were that the gods could cause illness, or it could be a curse, the unhappiness of the gods. And finally, bad smells. The Romans did believe that bad smells could cause illness. That's why when they set up their camps, villages, towns, they would plan it out very carefully and always make sure they were not near swamps, because they let off bad smells. And they had noticed that whenever camps were set up near swamps, that illness could spread. They didn't understand why, but they linked it to the bad smell. All of which is quite forward thinking for the time. Yes, we know the 4 humours, God and bad smells, are not the cause of illness. But that's not to say that the Romans were therefore somehow stupid because they didn't know germs caused illness. Instead, they were using what was around them. They were thinking logically, practically. So, for their time, it was forward thinking. And if you listen to the second podcast, you can hear how they started to use more logical treatment to therefore treat these causes of illness. Now, as we move into the Dark Ages, we actually see a period of regression. Now, the period from between 410 AD to 1000 AD is known as the Dark Ages, and this period starts when the Roman army leave in 410 AD. Now, this is still quite an important period, although there's not a lot of information around it on medicine because of the impact it actually has. Now, the collapse of the Roman Empire had a huge impact on Britain. Instead of one country being ruled by just Rome, Rome and Britain fractured, so broke down, into lots of smaller kingdoms, which often fought between each other. Each kingdom was ruled by a different king, so each wanted to have the most land, the most power. So after the Romans leave, the Roman army also goes, so law and order breaks down. So there's no one really keeping the peace. There's that war between tribes. There's no engineers or builders keeping the towns together, and no one really to stop invasion. So in the 5th and 6th centuries, you actually see tribes invading from all over Europe, the Saxons, for example. Also, there's a loss of one ruler and government. There's not that central point anymore, so there's no one to sort of oversee everybody's way, make sure everybody's health is kept, and certainly the priority of new rulers was not to be spending money on public health or investing in sort of research of any sorts into medicine. So there was a breakdown effectively, and this war and chaos broke the libraries, the books. It was too dangerous to travel. People's possessions and crops became destroyed, so many people moved into the countryside, and all of those libraries which were destroyed meant old ideas were destroyed. So there was a loss of intellectual understanding. Many people were illiterate in this time. Even kings of areas could not read or write. So the main belief that was used in this period to understand what caused disease was God, so religion and superstition. And many people would pray to become better, and you would have local wise men who would advise on what potentially could be causing an illness. And the idea of the four humours, bad smells, certainly went away. They regressed. They didn't exist as such during this time period. Certainly not until the end, from between about 8 to 900 AD, when we actually start to see the growth of the Christian church. Now, you may think when you hear church in medicine, straight away it's going to have a negative impact. Well, in fact, during this time period, it has a very positive impact on the understanding of the causes of disease. Now, I mentioned that wars meant that ideas were lost, libraries were destroyed, but in fact the church turned into a very much an international organisation. Priests could read and write, and they were actually centres of learning, churches, and people would keep the old text, would find the old text as they expanded across Europe, and would read and write and translate texts to be read by other intellectuals. Monasteries started to be built as well, so monks and nuns could treat the sick. The important thing here, though, is that Galen's theories started to be adopted and spread and encouraged to be used. The reason they liked Galen was because it fitted in with their beliefs that God created all beings. So they very much promoted Galen's ideas, so the Roman ideas of what caused illness. So as we move into the end of the Dark Ages, the start of the medieval era, you start to see the belief that the four humours once again caused illness. They did also believe very much that God caused illness. The Christian church promoted that if you were bad, if society did something bad, if they were sinning, that illness could be sent down, plague could be sent down as a punishment from God. Also, though, as people started to take more notice in education once again, they started looking to the stars, astrology, particularly from the 12th century onwards, to look for how planets coming into line, etc., certain star constellations could cause mass illness, mass unhealthiness in somebody. How somebody's star sign, for example, could mean an imbalance, perhaps in the four humours at that time. And finally, urine charts. Urine was very much seen as an indicator of perhaps why you could be ill. So many ideas anew come about, so astrology, stars, urine charts, they take and adapt the old, so the four humours, and there is still that belief in God, that underlying belief in God. So from the Dark Ages through to the medieval period, we actually see a progression, a move back to forward-thinking ideas of what could cause illness, and that is down to the church fundamentally, encouraging that. That's not to say the church have a positive influence throughout the whole period in the medieval era. Actually, from the sort of just up until about the 1350s onwards, the church have quite a negative impact from then on. They discourage anyone challenging Galen's ideas, because to challenge Galen would be to challenge the church. So they just wanted people to accept and believe that was the reason people were ill, and no other reason. And for a while that did work. But we have our case study, which is the plague, the Black Death. Now, the Black Death first rears its head in 1348, so in the start of the sort of 1350 period. And you have bouts of the plague right up until the end of the 1600s. Today, obviously, historians think that the disease was the bubonic plague, carried by fleas living on the back of rats, which brought the disease to different countries on trading ships. And you can actually see, if you have a charter map, how it starts from China and that trade moves right across Asia through to Europe, and obviously landing on the shores of Southampton in Britain. Bubonic plague is passed to humans when an infected flea bites them and the disease enters their blood. Now, obviously we know that's what caused illness today, but back then they didn't understand germs, so that was obviously not what they believed caused the illness. So back then there were a series of main reasons that they believed illness, this plague, had been caused. The first of all was religion. The church promoted the idea that God sent the plague as a punishment for people's sins. Second of all, astrology, as we've mentioned. The position of Mars, Jupiter and Saturn were very unusual at this time, so they thought that could have caused it. Miasma, though, the idea of bad smells starts to come about again, an idea the Romans used. So bad air or smells caused by rubbish, so decaying rubbish. Volcanoes, poisonous gases from European volcanoes and earthquakes carried in the air, so that idea of badness carried in the air. Four humours, once again, an idea of the Greeks and the Romans. Most physicians believe Galen's theory that all disease was caused by an imbalance in those humours. And if you look at the treatment of how physicians went about treating the Black Death, that does link in very considerably. And finally, outsiders. the superstition heavily grew through this period. The idea of outsiders, people who are strange or odd, particularly women who maybe didn't have any family and were on the outskirts of villages, became branded as witches who could have sort of put a spell, this plague upon the village. All of this is very superstitious, so very much based on some of the old ideas of the Romans, but really heavily superstitious ideas were promoted very heavily during the plague, and showed the limited understanding and that real continuity throughout the medieval period of what was causing illness. And that was down to that sort of quite negative continuity was down to the church, and also lack of influence of government in encouraging and prioritising public health as a whole. Now that continues largely right through to the Renaissance period, which begins around 1600. The Renaissance is the term given to the period in Europe meaning rebirth, so that renewal of old ideas, but also not just Galen's now, it's the whole idea, the whole basis of the ancient Greeks and the Romans. It's all the rebirth of ideas and theories in medicine, the idea fundamentally to test and challenge, to try and promote improvement, something the church were very negative against. It was also a great period of exploration when people in Europe discovered new parts of the world, new plants from Africa and America, all of which could be seen as really useful in medicine. Now, as a result of this, we would expect to see a really big change in what people are thinking is causing illness, therefore, during this period. But that is not actually the case. In fact, we don't see any real improvement during this period in what people understand to be causing illness. We begin to see, though, a change in mindset, a change in attitude, largely because during the Renaissance, we see a growth in a desire to use science and technology, looking more practically at things because of that idea of challenge from the Greeks and the Romans. They begin to abandon more supernatural ideas. Although the majority of people are still in belief in God, that's not to say they abandon their beliefs of God. The majority of people do still pray, etc. But supernatural ideas do begin to be abandoned, such as charms, etc. The main belief of physicians is in the four humours and bad smells, such as miasma, throughout this period, because they seem logical, thought through. Even the average person does start to question, to a certain extent, the influence of the church, because the plague actually took out many of the clergymen, so priests, vicars, that they would see. And it didn't really hold true that a God who was sending a disease down to punish people who had sinned would also punish these priests, who should be very much holy figures. Were the church lying to them, or were the church sinful, and therefore did there need to be a change? All of this played into the beginning of a detachment from the church, although that's not to say the church's influence in the Renaissance is completely gone. It is still influential, and many people do still believe in it. It's not really until 1750 to 1900 we begin to see new ideas. At the start of 1750, yes, we have a continuation of people believing the four humours caused illness still, miasma, and that miasma only grew in sort of strength in the fact it was causing illness, because as towns grew because of industrialisation, more diseases like diphtheria, cholera spread, and those towns were very smelly, dirty places, so therefore it made sense that bad smells would cause that illness. And you start to see government taking more of an interest in maybe trying to clean up those streets. At the turn of 1800, we also see a new idea, a new theory called spontaneous generation, though, and this is caused because of the factor of science and technology. A new instrument known as the microscope came about during the Renaissance, but by 1900 it had grown strong enough to start to see small organisms that today we now know are germs, but they didn't know they were germs. They could just see these sort of small things moving around, and they called those small things animalcules because they fundamentally believed they were animals, animalcules. And they believed that they spontaneously appeared, so they just appeared out of dirt and rubbish, hence why it's called spontaneous generation, and then that would cause illness. That's not really challenged and still continues up until 1861. So far we have seen real continuity fundamentally from this 1350 right through to around 1800 in what's causing illness. Yes, we see a slight change in them abandoning supernatural ideas, a move more towards logical miasma and spontaneous generation and for humans, but realistically very, very much the same. 1861 is our key era of year of change, and it changes most of medicine. That's because Louis Pasteur discovers germs. He publishes his ideas in 1864. It takes time for people to believe that germs cause illness, and he does have quite a negative reaction to begin with. But by the end of the 1900s, by the end of the 1800s, we do see people believing germs caused illness, and we see a rapid improvement throughout this period in treatment also. Many people, though, as I've said, were resistant up until about 1900. And key examples of this would be leading figures in medicine such as Florence Nightingale herself, who, although she wanted clean hospitals and promoted really clean hospitals, she didn't believe in germs. She rejected Louis Pasteur's belief, and actually she believed fundamentally in miasma, and as a result she wanted to keep things clean, have fresh air coming into the hospital wards, etc., because fresh air would mean a healthy environment. 1900 though is accepted, everyone generally accepts that germs cause illness, and as I say, treatment is therefore able to develop. And we see a sort of plateau happening then, a bit of not a dip negatively, but a sort of a continuity then just happening in the understanding of what causes illness until 1853. Now, the 20th century, so the 1900s, saw an investigation into the human body and how it was made up, cells. And these cells came to be known as DNA. But in 1953, two individuals at Cambridge University, Watson and Crick, identified how DNA was actually structured. And off the back of that, you started to see a development, an investigation into, well, how could the body itself cause illness? And in 1900, the Human Genome Project, led by Watson himself, began. And Watson wanted to locate all 35,000 genes that the human body held and its 23 chromosomes. And they actually were able to map this out due to teamwork and technology, allowing teamwork to be on a global scale through teams in, say, Germany, sending emails to people in Australia and then back to Britain. So it made communication much, much quicker, much faster. And by the end of that project, the whole human DNA was mapped, which actually led to the understanding of the hereditary conditions as a whole. Scientists could then come up with new techniques to graft skin better. There was a better understanding of conditions such as Down syndrome and leukemia, and whether people were more likely to develop certain forms of cancer caused as a result of their DNA. There has been further research and development techniques to alter faulty genes within the body and prevent genetic illnesses from developing. And the discovery has been made that stem cells, so those cells found in the bone marrow of long bones, can transform into various types of cells used around the body, which offers a chance of replacing faulty cells with healthy ones. So this greater understanding of the causes of disease given hereditary, so through your DNA, actually develop treatment also. I hope this podcast has been useful. As I say, there are 4 other podcasts. The next I would encourage you to listen to would be that of treatment, which will link in heavily to the developments in the causes of disease. Thank you for listening, and I hope for you to listen soon.